Hello, Professor Wartsim2, and today we would like to present you our response to three questions that are related to diet, economy, and national well-being across the countries. I'm Azimjon, this is Adi, and I will be taking over to question 17. So the question is, do long-term fat intake trends correlate with happiness? To come up with the answer to this question, we decided to use three perspectives. First, it's the long run. So basically, we compared the average fat intake that is from the years 1961 to 2022 with the happiness level records. The happiness level records are given for year 2015 as we found from the source of data set. And it was found that there's a very strong positive linear relationship between these two variables. Then for the perspective two, we compared the actual daily fat intake values for 2015 with the happiness level. Again, the same analytics were done as in perspective one, and we found that again there is a very strong positive relationship, and the correlation factor is more or less the same. In the perspective three, we decided to use a bit different approach where we found additional data sets from 2015 to 2019 for happiness level records, and we tried to analyze the change over the time for happiness and fat intake. And as you can see here on the table on the right hand side, there are the table of cases where the signs of happiness, the change in fat intake between 2015 and 19, and for the change in fat intake level for 1961 and 2022 to 2022. And from here, we can say that with an almost equal number of countries aligned and misaligned changes, so basically around 50 to 50%, it appears that shifts in fat intake are not reliable predictors for shifts in happiness over time. So basically, happiness is not a variable that dictates the change in the fat intake is not the variable that dictates the change in happiness. There are other additional factors that must be considered when analyzing the happiness of the population of the country. So basically, this is our response for question 17, and Adi will be taking over for question 18.
Okay, thank you, Azam. So now, Professor, for question 18, we wanted to know whether countries with more stable diets are actually happier. Now, we look at four key macronutrients, which are carbs, fats, animal, and plant protein, which was provided in the daily intake data set. So what we did basically is that for each data set from 1961 to 2022, we calculated the standard deviation and then the variance. So basically, low variance of these four macronutrients averaged means a stable diet, and high variance means a diet which has changed over time per country. And then we match this with the happiness data and the GDP per capita. So the first thing that we see was a simple correlation, the nutrient variation versus happiness. Professor, as you can see on the first slide, the relationship is basically flat. The correlation is about 0.07 and not significant. And you can see in the correlation matrix in the center of the slide, it shows something else very clearly, is that GDP absolutely dominates. GDP and happiness have a strong positive correlation of about 0.78, explaining roughly 62% of the variation. That suggests that any diet happiness signal might be hidden behind economics. So what are we basically saying? We are basically saying that once we hold health constant, a weak but statistically significant negative relationship appears between variation and happiness. That means that among countries with similar GDP, those with more stable diets tend to be slightly happier. Now we go on to the second slide, Professor, which tells us a deeper story. Now, this is why context matters so much. When we split countries by GDP level, as in high-income countries, low-income countries, developing countries, developed countries, in low-income countries, we see that there's basically no relationship. People are generally less happy, regardless of whether their diets are stable or not, because the main issue is poverty. Professor, you can see in countries like South Africa, in the African countries, clearly that it doesn't matter if they eat something completely different one day or the other, poverty is the main issue. And in opposition, for high income countries, we see a moderately negative correlation. Here, low variation can mean something very different: reliable access to good quality food all year round, and the ability to maintain a preferred, often healthier diet. In that context, constant stability seems to slightly support happiness. So we need to take into consideration the different levels that these countries are at. Now, Azim will go back and explain our question 23 analysis.
Thanks, Adi. Moving on, for question 23, we decided to see how fat and sugar, make changes or affect the the health and overall well-being or happiness of the country. So we came up with two approaches for fat and sugar. For fat, it was a longitudinal approach where we cleaned and matched nutrition and happiness datasets for years 2015 and between 2015 and 2019, because we have these datasets and they were available for us. For sugar, as we could not find any sugar intake levels across the years, we decided to stick to the cross-sectional approach and to analyze the sugar intake and the happiness, happiness, GDP, and the health of the nation for specific 2019. So what we found is that the GDP factor, both analysts explored whether the nutrient itself drives better outcomes. So what we found that if we compare the overall batch without countries, just comparing the GDP's health level and the happiness, there is a kind of linear relationship, as we can see on the left column of the graph. However, when we compare it with the factoring of GDP by, when we insert the GDP to the game, we can see that there are, let's say, for happiness distribution, there are 54 cases when 54 against 46 cases when the pattern mismatches. Basically the same as for question 17, when the fat intake level was not matching to the happiness level. So this means that basically we can conclude that richer countries tend to have more resources, therefore more access to the fat and sugar consumption, while it's not the case for poorer countries. So what we conclude is the fat and sugar do not really correlate or affect the well-being, economic state, and the happiness of the country. Adi will be taking over to the next parts.
So I think Professor Austin put it quite beautifully, and this is why we're so confident about our conclusion. So look first at the left column. Each row shows us a simple cross-sectional scatter plot. And Azam put it quite clearly that the richer countries, we have to look at GDP in that sense, and that the richer countries and the poorer countries have to be looked differently. So the message is that we shouldn't overreact with narrow nutrient taxes, and which is why I'll be going into the policy recommendations that we recommend on how to look at this case clearly. So we see that no systematic pattern, while reducing total fat at the population level on its own, improves happiness, health, or GDP. So what we propose is a fat tax policy should focus on structural economic reforms that we know matter, basically investing in healthcare, improving food affordability, and nudging the overall diet toward healthier fats. For example, promoting unsaturated fats and reducing trans fat. So I think we think fat is best handled as part of whole diet and welfare policy and not as a single isolated target. Sugar, on the other hand, is different. Here, we do not have strong intervention evidence from other countries because of the data set issues that Azim told us earlier about. Tiered sugar, so how we recommend is tiered sugar taxes like Mexico's per liter tax, UK's soft drinks tax that we clearly mentioned in our report that you can take a look at, Professor. And we don't want to waste much time here. So these kind of policies, we argue, are better for explicit regulation of sugar, and a tiered sugar warning, such as warning labels, subsidies for healthier options, are our proposed policy plan. So we go to the last and final slide, which is our final synthesis and how we looked across it all. So across all questions, one theme is consistent. The diet appears to correlate with happiness, but that correlation is largely a proxy for economics, which is basically GDP that we've kept reinstating. GDP is the dominant driver of national well-being. Fat and sugar are just symptoms of that development. which means richer countries eat more of both, but they're not the root cause of higher happiness or health. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you, Professor.